Robert Higgs is Senior Fellow in Political Economy at the Independent Institute. He received his PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of 8 books and the editor or co-editor of 6 others, including my longtime personal favorite, Crisis and Leviathan, and his most recent book, Depression, War, and Cold War. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Financial Times, and many, many others. Please welcome Robert Higgs.
Well, that opening talk by Bumper was rousing, as we would expect it to be, and my being next is what's known as balance. And those of you who have heard me talk before will understand what I'm driving at here. In any event, it's an honor for me to be included among the speakers at this conference. The speakers here include many distinguished and courageous opponents of the present wars and of the government's conduct of the so-called war on terror. Some of them are working at the barricades to expose or stop the government's unjust actions, and I hold them in the highest regard for their services to humanity. My own work is much less important. I work not as these heroic activists do, but only as a writer, editor, and analyst. Whatever I may have to offer is aimed not at stopping the government in its tracks, however much I wish I had the power to do so, but at helping the general public to understand better the situation in which we find ourselves. Such efforts, however, may still have some value because unless we understand our situation correctly, our political actions and other efforts in the service of peace may be misdirected and hence fruitless. With this understanding as background, I will offer my remarks here today. All wars end, but someone must bring them to an end. Someone in authority must order the men to stop fighting, or the fighters themselves must decide to stop fighting, even if doing so requires that they disobey standing orders. Either way, someone makes a decision to bring the war to an end. And we may presume that the actor makes the decision only because he believes that it serves his interest. However, he may conceive of that interest. In general, in our day, nations do not go to war spontaneously, nor do they lay down their arms spontaneously. National leaders make those decisions, and they make them in their own interest. Any other view is romantic and obscurantist, notwithstanding the torrents of propaganda by which leaders and their court intellectuals attempt to represent themselves as servants of the nation, as embodiments of the national will, as executors of the public interest. Even if political and military leaders were inclined to put the public's interest ahead of their own, they would have no way to identify such a foggy and multifaceted entity. Each individual has many interests, and different individuals have different sets of interests. And nobody has discovered a defensible method of aggregating all those interests into a single social interest. Although we may feel confident that for the great multitude, peace is preferred to war, other things being equal, even this claim is contestable. Anyone who circulates in American society knows full well that many Americans love war and killing. And other things being equal, they would be delighted to have the U.S. military constantly engaged in slaughtering people around the world. Fortunately, such individuals count no more heavily than their peace-loving neighbors, so long as they do not hold positions of high political authority. The people do not decide questions of war and peace directly, and even their indirect effect on the decision process is usually tenuous and variable. As a first approximation, the realistic political scientists may take for granted that in this country, the masses don't count. In most cases, they can be brought to acquiesce in anything the movers and shakers dictate that they do, notwithstanding a modicum of grumbling and disobedience at the margins. Although some people recognize that specific self-interested leaders make the decisions that plunge the nation into war, many fewer people employ this insight systematically in seeking to understand why wars end. Too often, people simply presume that one side unequivocally defeats the other, and therefore the other capitulates because it has no capacity for further fighting. Rarely, however, is this depiction accurate. Even in horribly damaged and occupied societies, individuals may continue to fight in some fashion, if only as loosely organized civilian insurgents or guerrillas combating an occupation force. In 1945, for example, the Germans and the Japanese might have continued to fight in various ways, and indeed, the U.S. authorities were surprised when they did not do so. In Iraq, during the U.S. occupation of the past 5 years, resistance has been stout, if temporally fluctuating and spatially shifting. Given the circumstances there, it seems unlikely that the resistance fighters will give up completely until U.S. and other foreign forces leave the country. Therefore, if the war is to end, rather than to continue indefinitely, as Senator John McCain is pleased to contemplate, that end will come only when U.S. leaders determine that its continuation no longer serves their interest. I'm setting aside here the possibility that there be a general mutiny in which U.S. armed forces refuse to continue fighting. Although this event is conceivable, I can't foresee its occurrence in prevailing circumstances. Therefore, the question becomes, what events might bring the U.S. authorities to conclude that stopping the war serves their interest? We have two important precedents for the ending of a major U.S. neo-imperialist war, the Korean War and the Vietnam War, especially the latter. Although neither case provides a perfect analogy, comparisons may still be worthwhile as we try to identify the events and influences that bring U.S. political leaders to perceive that continuation of such a war no longer serves their interest. I want to speak now for a while about the Iraq War as a catastrophic success. On the campaign trail in October 2004, Vice President Dick Cheney created a small stir when, speaking of the Iraq War, he declared, quote, "I think it has been a remarkable success story to date when you look at what has been accomplished overall," end quote. In view of the rampant violence raging in Iraq, the widespread devastation of the country's human and material resources, and the dim prospects for its future peace and prosperity, Cheney's statement seemed bizarre, and the Democrats seized on it as still another example of the disconnect between the Bush administration and reality. Yet, on closer inspection, we can see that the war has indeed been a huge success, though not in the way that the Vice President intended to claim. In a characteristically unwitting way, President George W. Bush himself stumbled upon a resolution of the seeming paradox when he told Time magazine in the summer of 2004 that the war had proved to be a, quote, catastrophic success. By that oxymoron, he sought to convey the idea that the invasion